Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I wanted to personally invite you to an in-person event that we're having. It's a summer solstice fundraiser for Let's Share the Sun on Thursday, June 5th from 6 to 10 p.m. in Jersey City, New Jersey. We'll have a link to this on the notes of the podcast. I hope you could make it, and let's get into it.
The Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee advanced a bill, which they're calling One Big Beautiful Bill if you're following the social media, that would permanently extend the Trump 2017 tax cuts. But along with it, it would do a number of different things that directly impact our industry. And as the SEIA CEO today, Abby Hopper, said, that effectively dismantles the most successful industrial onshoring effort in the U.S. history.
Hello and welcome to the Solar Maverick podcast, where solar meets entrepreneurship and experience. I'm your host, Benoy Thanjan, so let's get into it.
Hi, this is Benoy, your host of the Solar Maverick podcast. I'm really excited on this episode of the Solar Maverick podcast to have Scott Elias. He's from CleanCapital. Scott and I have actually known each other for a very long time. He's the director of policy and market development at CleanCapital, and he was at SEIA for a long time, specifically focused on the Mid-Atlantic states. If you don't know SEIA, it's Solar Energy Industries Association. And I guess you have also the AKA Scotty Solar. I appreciate Scott. Sorry, I feel weird calling you Scotty. Has been a listener of the Solar Maverick podcast. I appreciate him promoting different episodes on the CleanCapital Slack channel. We're actually going to be talking about a lot of the federal advocacy efforts to protect the ITC, which obviously everyone in the solar industry is very focused on. And welcome to the podcast, Scott. It's great to have you. I appreciate you making time. I know it's been crazy sort of years to start off, and thank you for making the time and being a listener and being a maverick yourself.
Thanks for having me. It'll be good to go from being on it, from listening to it for so many years.
What I've been excited too, Scott, is like CleanCapital has their own podcast as well, which is called Experts Only. It's actually been around longer than the Solar Maverick podcast, and Scott leads different episodes there. So I've been listening to content that he's been creating for CleanCapital or Experts Only podcast, and it's given me ideas, and we've created episodes based on episodes that Scott has hosted at Experts Only. I think, Scott, it would be great if you could start off with giving an overview of CleanCapital if people are not familiar, and specifically your role.
Sure. So CleanCapital is a leading independent power producer focused on distributed clean energy, including middle market solar and energy storage. We really sort of own that sort of front of the meter DG space, but we also have on-site behind the meter projects in our portfolio. But basically, we develop, build, own, operate, and invest in clean energy assets across the US and its territories, either directly or through different partners. And then I am the director of policy and market development, where I basically help them assess the political and policy risks and opportunities at the state and federal level.
Yeah, that's a great summary of what you do. And, maybe too, if you could briefly talk about your background before. I talked about it a little bit before. And obviously, you had many different roles at SEIA. It was not just the Mid Atlantic. That was like kind of, at the end of your career.
Yeah, it's funny. So I actually started out my solar journey of like, how did I become Scotty Solar, as they call me, is funny. So I started out as an intern for a member of Congress, helping the energy and tax staffer, where I recommended that they endorse bipartisan legislation to make the solar investment tax credit have that commence construction provision. So that was like, I think 2014 or 2015. I learned about through that process that there was this organization called SEIA, or the Solar Energy Industries Association, that was behind that change. And, I saw they had a paid internship. A lot of places didn't have paid internships. And I joined as a government affairs intern for SEIA, the entity that was, sort of back then under Ron Resch trying to get some changes to the investment tax credit, extend it, commence construction, et cetera. And then from there, I kind of stayed and had a couple of different hats. I started out on their membership team where I was telling people invest in policy, join at different levels. Then I sort of switched and started to help them out with like the education content at SPI back then. And now I guess RE Plus and the various regional shows. And then slowly from there, switched over into doing state affairs, and ultimately kind of ended my years at SEIA as their Mid-Atlantic State Affairs Director. A couple different hats there, but it all began with the ITC.
That's amazing. I mean, to hear about that, and it's funny you talk about Ron Roche. I saw him actually at RE Plus last year. Didn't get a chance to talk to him, but I always have great conversations with him, and it's just interesting as well to obviously hear your solar journey and some of the provisions, obviously with the ITC. And then I worked with you as well too on some of the Mid Atlantic stuff, specifically in Pennsylvania, with creating an SREC program or recreating or changing the SACP. So it's been interesting because you've seen like all the iterations, both on the federal and state level. And that's some of the stuff that obviously we're going to cover today. I know there's a lot going on, but you do a great job of like summarizing a lot of complicated topics into like just sort of basic things. Can you give like our Mavericks like an update of what's happening on Capitol Hill and what's at stake for the solar industry if they're not familiar with it regarding like the ITC?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the sort of short story is that last week in the early hours of Wednesday morning after a 17-hour all-nighter, Tax Writing Ways and Means Committee advanced a bill, which they're calling One Big Beautiful Bill if you're following the social media, that would permanently extend the Trump 2017 tax cuts. But along with it, it would do a number of different things that directly impact our industry. And as the SIA CEO today, Abby Hopper, said, that effectively dismantles the most successful industrial onshoring effort in the US history. So what that bill did, where we're at now, is the Ways and Means Committee is sort of the tax writing committee. It sort of launched its proposal, and it still needs to go through the different iterations of getting through sort of the budget committee, the ultimate House floor, and then from there go over to the Senate and then to the president's desk. So what happened after that was on Friday, the House Budget Committee was supposed to also sort of pass this. They had some hiccups there, and we can talk about why. But ultimately, they sort of reconvened, had an emergency meeting Sunday night, and then now the House Budget Committee has also sort of signaled its approval on this resolution. And so the next step is it's going to go eventually to the full House floor. And so, depending on when you're listening to this, this may have already occurred. But on Wednesday of this week, before Memorial Day, the House Rules Committee is meeting at 1 a.m. You heard that correctly, 1 a.m. in the middle of the night, where they are going to move this forward. And if they get all the votes together, the House is going to pass this bill out of the House before Memorial Day recess. And then it'll go on over to the Senate, where the Senate will either mark it up, tweak it, adopt it as is. Probably won't happen that way. And then ultimately, both the Senate and the House need to agree to a single bill that will go to the president's desk. So there's a lot to make out of what has happened. The short story is that rather than a scalpel approach, this big, beautiful bill is really a big, bad sledgehammer for the clean energy industry. And we can kind of dive into just why.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great summary of what's happening in this podcast episode, which is a great point about dates, is Monday, May 19th. And there could be a lot, obviously, that changes. But I think like high level, we kind of know what they're proposing with the ITC. Can you talk about like what the different components of the changes of, obviously the Inflation Reduction Act and what was proposed, and then what the changes potentially will be?
So I guess I'll answer that in a couple ways. So first, the bill eliminates the 25D residential solar credit after December 31st, 2025. So under this bill, the whole home ownership model where you are having a solar loan and it's not a third party owned model is obviously much further at risk. And then in addition to that, it is phasing out the 4080, 45Y tech neutral tax credits for projects that are placed in service after 2028. It keeps the bonus credits in there. Those are not repealed, but moving forward, you have a 20% credit reduction for facilities placed in service in the calendar year 2029, a 40% reduction for facilities placed in service in the calendar year 2030, a 60% reduction for facilities placed in service in calendar year 2031, and then no ITC at all for projects placed in service after December 31st, 2031. So major changes to the overall structure of having the 30% ITC or the various bonus credits of what it'll actually add up to. While I mentioned the bonus credits, do remain in place, the direct pay provisions do remain in place. It also changes transferability. Transferability is repealed for the tech neutral tax credits for projects that begin construction 2 years after the date of enactment. Slightly different for 45X, where the 45X is the manufacturing tax credit. That transferability is repealed for them for components sold after December 31st, 2027. And then there's what I would call like the big problem that I sort of see with what they do is it's not just that they change the structure of it from a place and service model, which is very different than the current status quo where you commence construction. And you can talk about why that's problematic, but it also includes several complex and potentially unworkable foreign entity of concern restrictions, both at the ownership and the component level. And what that means is effectively that if you are building a project, this language becomes law, would need to be able to definitively prove that there is no component, subcomponent, or critical mineral that was extracted, processed, recycled, manufactured, or assembled by what they are calling a prohibited foreign entity, and that you can't also use projects that rely on intellectual property from such entities. And so what we're talking about is a massive set of red tape that does not have clear guidance on how you would comply. And it's going to create all sorts of headaches for developers, for financiers, and for lawyers.
Yeah, definitely. I didn't realize the scope of that because if you think about it, Scott, you could talk about this more like creation of the cells, right? That doesn't happen. I mean, we're building obviously the infrastructure within the US, but it's really more the assembly, right? And we haven't got to the cell creation part, which is predominantly obviously happening in China. So I don't see how in a short period of time that basically you could move that supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting there. I think, emphasis is on getting there, right? Like we've seen now, if you look at, domestic manufacturing capacity, it surpassed 50 gigawatts in early 2025. But to your point, that's assembling the modules, right? We are starting to see the onshoring of cells. We are seeing the onshoring eventually. There are some announcements around, wafers and domestic poly or solar grade poly. But you're right, that's not something that you can kind of do overnight. And so what we're dealing with is a really complicated problem. And listen, I think a lot of us share the goal of reducing reliance on China and strengthening domestic supply chains. But if you look at the actual language, it's just too broad, too ambiguous, and impossible to implement in the real world. So, like, just keep in mind, like, projects could lose eligibility if any single component or mineral is indirectly tied to a foreign adversary, or rather, you can't prove that it's not, even if what you are buying is actually manufactured in the United States. So, we're talking about inverters, we're talking about modules, we're talking about the subcomponents of those, and a whole set of red tape of how you would actually comply. It's not clear, for instance, what sort of framework for how developers would prove compliance. Like, can you do self-certification? Is supplier attestations okay? Is there going to be a government approved vendor list? I mean, there's so many questions that are left unanswered. And if you think about it, given sort of the end of the Chevron deference, which has nothing really to do with this, but what it means is like Congress needs to be pretty precise. And so when you have these vague statutory terms that are more vulnerable to litigation, basically what we've created is a recipe that's just risk for companies. And it's going to make it really difficult for people to make long-term investment decisions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this creates a lot of confusion. As we all know, like investors don't like uncertainty, and having nebulous language in law will cause, like, obviously, investors to pull back, which we're seeing in a sense with obviously the tariffs and obviously the potential changes with Inflation Reduction Act. And then as far as the like investment tax credit itself, I know it was supposed to be for like 10 years. Is it true that they're saying now basically 5 years is the term or?
Well, it depends how you look at it. I mean, so the way that the current law is written, you basically have the ITC until the later of 2032 or when greenhouse gas emissions are reduced, right? That construct, throw it out the window. There's sort of what is out there that is currently proposed. And then we could talk in a moment about sort of like the politics of, is it going to get worse or is it going to get better, right? I think what we see now is a place and service requirement where, for over a decade, energy projects have qualified for tax credits when they begin construction, right? That's clear for financiers. The bill, though, would reverse that, right? And so I think, I mentioned before the overall timelines that are changing, right? You get a certain ITC, the full value if you're placed in service, before 2028. But if your project bleeds over into 2029 or 2030 or 2031, you're quickly seeing that you're dealing with very different percentages than what you might have assumed before. And that is extremely complicated and bad for financing because you're talking about a whole different calculation of how much tax equity you need based on things that are outside of your control, like interconnection from the utility or construction timelines or supply chain shortages. So that single change from commenced construction to place in service really sort of undermines the current construct of how you think about when these projects, are going to be financed and how they're going to be financed.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you explaining that, something that's really important for the solar industry to understand. And then what about like the adders? Obviously, there's energy communities, there's the US, own. How is that being impacted, like the additional adders?
The good news is they're not being repealed, right? The bad news is it's sort of you add it up and then you do your reduction, right? So, you can in theory get the 30% ITC with a 10%, domestic content adder and the, 10% energy community adder, but no longer will you adding that up be 30 plus 10 plus 10, right? It'll become a 20% reduction in 2029 and a 40% reduction of what that previously was in 2030 and so forth. So you keep the overall adders, but the overall percent you get is going to be reduced over time after 2028.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. And then I know I've been reading about how potentially, like, the Senate has potentially looked at the bill, and people are saying that maybe it actually might be more favorable for the solar industry. Is that correct? Or am I totally off by what I've been
Well,
reading out there?
I think there's two sort of competing narratives, I would say, and it's like kind of fluid and it's sort of changing. I think what you're referencing is there were some immediate comments from some senators that said, like, this looks unworkable and maybe the Senate will be the backstop, right? Like, after Ways and Means launched this, you also on the House side had 13 Republicans led by Representative Garbarino and Representative Kiggins who said, we need to make some changes. And they said, we want to maintain transferability through the phase out. They said they want to soften the component sourcing restrictions we talked about before. And they said they want to keep a commenced construction standard instead of switching to a place in service standard. And there's some thinking that gives cover to the Senate to also make changes to that regard. And you heard some comments from different senators that also implied they're not going to accept this as is. There's some concerns from Senator Kramer, who is the Senate Finance Committee chairman, about, the tech neutral credit in particular. And so they can make their mark on it. Now, that being said, while there is some dialogue and sort of conversations about will the Senate improve this, you also have the push and pull of the House dynamics that could actually potentially make this go in the wrong direction. So what I was talking about before is the language as it was advanced from the Ways and Means Committee. And I mentioned, like, at the onset that there was this conversation of, well, the Budget Committee, was supposed to meet on Friday and they failed to advance it. And then they met on Sunday and they advanced it. But what was left out of that is that you had 4 sort of hardline conservatives who voted present instead of in favor. And they have claimed, and we're sort of operating now in what is maybe going to happen, what has happened. But one of the many issues that they have been focused on is, does this bill go far enough, right? What you have at a high level is the Speaker of the House struggling to unify around a massive reconciliation package. And you have the hardline conservatives who are demanding spending cuts, deeper spending cuts, including to Medicaid, including what they're calling for is a full repeal of the IRA. They want these phased out yesterday, not in, after 2028. And then you have obviously this other dynamic around SALT, which we can talk about, but isn't necessarily relevant to us. Those, though, are competing demands in direct conflict. Some that want to save money, some that want to spend more. And allegedly, part of the commitment to turn some of those hardliners from no votes to present has been that House leadership has floated the idea that they may actually cut off these clean energy tax credits even earlier. And so Punchbowl News and Politico have talked about, well, maybe they speed that up to the end of 2028. What we don't know is, what does that specifically mean, given sort of the phase out schedule that we were already concerned with that I was telling you. So there's a possibility that the House actually makes this worse before it gets over to the Senate. There's a possibility that doesn't happen. And then, of course, there is the possibility, will the Senate sort of be that final backstop? But there's a lot of uncertainty here. I will say, if you think about it, if last week was like the first mile in the marathon, we are hovering near the 10th mile. So we have another, 16 miles to go. So, this bill may get past the House this week. When you're listening to this, it may have already passed the House, but there's a lot of race left over on the Senate side before this is buttoned up into a law that the president is actually going to sign.
Yeah, definitely. And I know you mentioned the time frame. Can you mention it again? Is there anything else that we should talk about the investment tax credit? Also, too, like you mentioned earlier, CleanCapital has been active with getting the solar industry to reach out to their representatives and have been organizing fundraisers. Can you talk about like how our listeners or Mavericks could get involved with potentially reaching out to their local senator or House of Representative?
Sure. So I'll start first with like the timeline, and then I can go, specifically to like what can you do if you're listening to this. In terms of the timeline, the House has sort of a self-imposed deadline to get the overall package out of the House by Memorial Day break. They are going on break, and so by Memorial Day is their self-imposed deadline. And then the Senate and the House together have a deadline of July 4th. It is very possible that we bleed past July 4th. Those are sort of the two markers in the sand. Have it pass the House by Memorial Day, and then on the Senate side, have a bill that's ready for the president to sign by July 4th. There's a lot of sort of minutia that will happen in between with various committees, but I'm not going to bore you with that now. We can kind of rehash that if you want, but those are the ways to think about it. In terms of like, what can you do? I think, at a minimum, people should be calling their members of Congress where they live or where they have projects and investments. I think calls and actual individualized letters via email really are sort of the most impactful thing you can do if you're not directly meeting with your members. And invite members to go visit your sites. Ask for meetings with members or their staff. But I think making sure that you communicate your story of why this is important and how this is going to impact your business is the single most effective tool the industry has at their disposal at this particular moment.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great summary of everything. And I know it's a lot of information, and you did a great job of summarizing a lot of complicated information in a very easy, digestible format. And that's why you are Scotty Solar. And I appreciate you coming on the podcast and making time. I know it's been like nonstop for you. And, we're going to transition obviously to another topic. Obviously, you mentioned CleanCapital is one of the largest like IPPs in the US market. I guess which states are you CleanCapital most bullish in terms of, you know, solar, whether it be to incentives, policy stability, or market maturity? I know things have been like challenging in a sense because I think we all thought once at the election happened that states would be picking up the steam for, the lack of federal legislation or, a nice way without the federal support that there would be basically states and corporates that would make up that lack of support. But we're seeing in certain states the opposite of that, which is actually very interesting to me. And we were talking about this, I know, in the pre-interview for the podcast.
Yeah, interesting. I'd call it concerning. Yeah. I mean, I'll just briefly address what you said there. I mean, yeah, you have New Jersey contemplating retroactive devaluation of legacy, solar assets. You have a situation in Maine where they're looking at retroactive changes to the net energy billing program. You have, Minnesota looking at, sort of retroactively repealing its new community solar program that they just launched. You have California looking at retroactively changing contract terms for sort of, the initial NEM 1.0 and 2.0 projects. So that is all concerning developments. What I will say is I'll answer your initial question with what's positive. It sounds like Maryland is doing a lot of the good things. Maryland is in the process of transitioning its pilot program for community solar into a permanent program. I think that is, a program that, we think looks great. I'm excited to see sort of the progress we have there. There's still a lot of positive things to be said about, New York in particular. I would say New York Energy Storage is a place that, we've seen a lot of, activity there. And I think there's the like what may be coming. And I think people are sort of anxiously awaiting what does Massachusetts do with, Smart 3.0 or a successor there. But I would say, in general, we're really excited about a number of different markets that are out there, but we're just, I think, as with many, sort of monitoring sort of the political and policy risks that are associated with these programs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's interesting, obviously, Maryland and community solar. I mean, is there concerns that it's a smaller state? You already had a pilot program, whether there'll be enough projects?
I think there's always a concern that there's not enough megawatts for any of these markets. Maryland is going to be a program that is uncapped except for the overarching NEM cap, right? So it's moving away from its sort of previous program that had a bunch of sort of specific caps for specific types of things. And so I think that's a positive. But, there's also New Mexico, right? Where I think we're excited about New Mexico. Finally, projects are coming online there, and there's going to be another 300 megawatts eventually. So I think anytime you're talking about front of the meter DG, there is going to be caps on the amount of megawatts, but it's just sort of a question of which are the most attractive megawatts. And we're always at CleanCapital looking at, if you have the megawatts and you want to bring it to us, we're happy to be the long-term owner.
Yeah, definitely. And can you talk too about like, I guess you're flexible. I mean, Clean Capital when it first started was just in-service assets, then it was COD assets, and now it seems like Clean Capital is moving earlier in the development cycle. Obviously, you've had like acquisitions and partnerships with developers, as well. So can you talk about like what's like an ideal type of project?
Yeah, I think for us, we really, I said before we develop, build, own, and operate and invest in clean energy assets. And like, that's really what I mean. We're looking at operating assets to expand to our portfolio. We're looking at projects that are pre-NTP that we'll bring into our portfolio. We're looking at, projects that we self-develop. I mean, you mentioned acquisitions. We bought BQ Energy, which is a leading developer of, brownfields and landfills. And so, we're doing a lot of that type of stuff. But I think we're trying to really, engage in what we're calling this middle market space. Some people will define it as 1 to 20 megawatts, but I think really, distribution connected front of the meter assets are sort of our bread and butter.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate you explaining. This is actually really interesting to me. Like you worked a long time, obviously, in policy advocacy for SEIA, which is the largest solar lobbying group. How has that transition been? Obviously, now you've been at Clean Capital for a few years,
Yeah.
like an IPP, which is like totally different. And then, yeah, I'm curious just from my own, I think our audience too would be interested because it's a very different business model.
I feel like I'm going to business school sometimes. I mean, I think it would benefit like every staffer, whether they're at SEIA or a local affiliate like MinSEIA or, CCSA, all the trade associations, like the staff for them to like sign an NDA and just like shadow how the private companies do it. I think, for me, the biggest difference has been like I understood previously policy, but being able to connect these policy variables to like what does it literally do to dollar and cents, like how does that impact whether or not an investment is a good investment or not? That is sort of the difference maker. And I think it's been rewarding to really understand like how this stuff actually impacts whether or not we can deploy capital and build these types of projects.
Yeah, definitely. That's like great because you have such a strong policy background, and then to bring that, and then obviously how it translates to investment decisions, like it brings another perspective that I feel
Totally.
a lot of people on the policy side don't have unless they're obviously within a private corporation. So that's
Right.
great.
And the flip side of it is I think I've realized, I obviously understands the in and outs of like how does SEIA as an entity operate and what do they have to offer and what do their affiliates have to offer and what does CCSA and like the various alphabet soup of various trade associations. But I think that is like a mundane task and it's like not necessarily clear to the people in the industry of like all the different things the different trade associations are doing. So I think the vice versa of that is like trying to connect people to be like, well, you have an issue with this, go talk to this person. You have an issue with that, go talk to this organization. So it's a little bit of both. It's like one, it's eye-opening for me in the sense of like, this is why this stuff matters, but it's also like, these are the different entities and personnel that can help us with these problems.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. I appreciate you explaining that. And then too, like I thought it would be great to get like your perspective of what trends you're seeing in the solar industry. Obviously, we've talked about
Yeah.
several trends, but there's obviously a lot of different trends that are happening. And I think you have a unique vantage point too from where you're sitting. And it would be great
Yeah.
if you could share it with the other.
Sure, sure. I mean, at a high level, like I just start by saying like, at the end of the day, despite sort of I don't want to call it doom and gloom, but like we were talking about some serious existential threats to the industry. While that's all going on, like solar is the fastest growing, fastest to deploy energy source available, period. Right. We haven't seen a single technology add 50 gigawatts or more in close to 20 years by now. And I think like what we're seeing is without more capacity, America will lose the AI race to China. So if you look at like just the Wood Mackenzie sort of year-end reports, like solar accounted for 66% of all new electric generation capacity. Domestic module manufacturing grew at an unprecedented 190% year over year. So went from 14.5 gigawatts at the end of 2023 to 42.1 gigawatts at the end of 2024. And now we're over 50 gigawatts. So like solar manufacturing is back. Call it assembly or what you want, but like that is back. And that's just like the beginning. And then you look at it like commercial solar, I'll just give you two other segments that I care about or CleanCapital cares about. The commercial segment, over 2.1 gigawatts in 2024, an annual record with 8% year over year growth. And then the community solar market segment installed 1.7 gigawatts in 2024, which is the largest ever year of capacity and a remarkable 35% increase over 2023. So there's a lot of headwinds that are out there, but like we should also just like take a step back and realize this is some serious growth. And I think, we obviously need to figure out the federal picture, but we are on a good trajectory from just like an industry standpoint. And, there's going to be the policy clouds and we're going to hopefully navigate through those and tweak them. But we are seeing some really, really positive trends.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's the overarching trend, right? Electricity prices are going to go up substantially. You mentioned obviously the SREX and like obviously the PGM, the capacity market auction is going to increase electricity prices. They're saying 20% starting in June. And people are starting to see obviously the increase in prices, and it's going to increase even more and more dramatically. And it's not going to be like it was before, where it was relatively stable and short incremental increases. They're going to see substantial. And, it's surprising to me, though. Obviously, that's the big thing. Solar is going to grow exponentially and continue to grow, that the politics related to it. And it's not just even a Republican issue, it's a Democrat issue. When you talk about like New Jersey or California, like why do you think there is this like I have my own opinions, but I'm curious to like
I think affordability. I think that we as an industry need to tell a better story of the benefits we bring, right? On some level, it's like obvious when you're generating electricity closer to load, there are tangible benefits, right? There's less wear and tear on the grid, right? Like if you think about it, like if you build a new road in a certain community and you've reduced the congestion of the amount of ways that different people can drive on a road, like that benefits everyone. But like we're only focusing on the cost piece. We're only focusing on the fact that someone had to build that new road and that new road wasn't free. So I think what's happening is a lot of these states are so over focused on the cost that they're not adequately recognizing the value. And, maybe that has to do with utility talking points in certain states, or maybe it has to do with the composition of the legislature in certain states. But I think we need to do a better job of telling the story of the value that both distributed energy resources and utility scale resources bring. It's not a transmission scale only or distribution connected only. It's like, it's both. And how do we tell that story? And right now, unfortunately, we're not doing a great job of communicating that story in a way that is really capturing the hearts and minds of the legislatures in a number of different countries, and not countries, states.
of course it's almost 50 different countries
It feels like that sometimes.
for sure. And obviously like New York had the value of distributed energy resources. That was a way of basically valuing the benefits to the grid that, obviously distributed resources would have. And I agree with you. We're not doing a great job communicating this. And then the other thing too, like I've been talking a lot about the podcasts is, it's the cheapest form, right, of energy to come online and the fastest form. But then also, you talked about like the network benefits with the upgrades and obviously line loss and things like I won't go into all the details like that. But then energy independence, like especially we're going to see more instability of the grid. You're going to start seeing electricity prices going up substantially. I think people are going to be a lot more receptive. And if we use energy independence versus these sort of main talking points, we have to simplify it because I think people
Right.
get confused.
If you think about our own industry, right? It's like sometimes you're saying DER, sometimes it's DER, sometimes it's front of the meter, sometimes it's behind the meter, sometimes it's on site. It's like we complicate everything. We just need to like simplify, simplify, simplify. Because if we don't, like we're susceptible to being the scapegoat as to why electric costs are going up. Now, are we the reason why? No. But like it's easy if we don't have a clear message for others to sort of say a bad message and have it be a convincing message.
Yeah, for sure. And we've lived that obviously already, and we know how that's like. And I think, yeah, we as an industry have to educate and simplify, which you're so correct. We make things, I feel like, more complicated with the jargon. And as I mentioned before, CleanCapital has a podcast called Experts Only. I've actually had John Powers and Tom Byrne on the Solar Maverick podcast. They're the two partners of CleanCapital. And actually, Tom was the one who told me to start the Solar Maverick podcast. So I think Experts Only started maybe 2016 or 15. We started 2018. So I think like I learn a lot from your podcast, and I've gotten great ideas for listening to obviously experts only. Can you talk about and go into more detail about it? And sometimes too, like it used to be just John really hosting it, but now Scott, like obviously you're becoming a lot more involved and you're hosting different episodes. Can you tell our audience? Obviously have the link in the notes.
Yeah. So John Powers is our president and one of the co-founders, along with Tom. He served previously as President Obama's chief sustainability officer, and he really created this experts only podcast where, we explore solutions to climate change by talking to industry leaders about the intersection of energy, innovation, and finance. So sometimes that's, in-depth conversations about why community solar didn't come to be in California. Sometimes it's about sort of the latest with ESG, but it's really sort of a forum for understanding the intersection of energy, innovation, and finance. And yeah, John has let me co-host a couple shows, and hopefully I'll get to co-host a couple more.
Yeah, definitely. And we'll obviously have the link of that in the podcast as well. You mentioned actually, which I thought was great, some Wood Mac trends on like new generation of solar and how much of the energy production or new additions it was last year. You were at from like, I guess it's 2024, end of 2024. And then you were actually at the Wood Mac conference. I think it was 2 weeks ago, right? Or 3 weeks ago in Denver.
It's all blur, but yes.
I'm sure. It's the solar coaster. And by the way, like, yeah, I feel the blur too, for sure. So much has been going on. And you were on a panel talking about like Let's Share the Sun Foundation. We've had actually Let's Share the Sun Foundation on 3 episodes of the Solar Maverick podcast. And I was actually in Puerto Rico with some colleagues of yours at CleanCapital, and we were installing solar plus storage. Can you talk about that panel and Let's Share the Sun Foundation is and how
Yeah, sure.
Capital's involvement? Because
Yeah. So Let's Share the Sun is an awesome organization. So, if you're not familiar with them, go Google, stop what you're doing, Google them. They are a nonprofit organization that collaborates with local communities to identify, organize, develop, and install solar in impoverished communities across Puerto Rico. And a group of us, so SIA had a board meeting in Puerto Rico, and there was a retreat where you could go and join this trip. And CleanCapital is actually a longtime funder of Let's Share the Sun. And so we every year sort of have a raffle for what employees are able to go on the trip. And I lost like 2 years in a row, and I got to cheat a little bit because I was there for the SIA board meeting, so I got to go. But basically, we went and installed solar plus storage systems in impoverished communities in Juntas, Puerto Rico. And for me, we installed a solar and battery system for a family facing frequent days-long outages where power and the ability to charge just like aren't there. And so Pedro, who was the individual whose home we installed the solar and storage project on, he literally had to drive like over 40 miles multiple times a week just to access dialysis and get refrigerated medicine, because the reality he lives with is not reliable power. And obviously you can't have your medicine or do dialysis without electricity. So, with reliable power from the sun and a battery, he now has something far more valuable than electricity. And so what we did at this WoodMac event was we had a forum where we talked about this organization. We talked about the story of what we were doing, why we were doing it. And like, for me, like, we just talked about everything going on in DC. Like, there's a lot of noise. And like, amidst that noise, it was an opportunity both for me to remind myself, but also to tell others, like, why do I do what I do? Why should I not be too jaded at this moment? And so I left both sort of actually Puerto Rico, but also, that panel inspired to continue promoting the sense of community I felt in Juntas, and inspired to keep on working to build a more equitable, decarbonized energy system. So it really was an awesome, rewarding experience participating. Anyone can. Companies can sponsor it like CleanCapital does, but it was really just an amazing opportunity where like I sit here and analyze the policies that enable solar deployment, but I finally got to actually pick up a panel, slap it like they say, in the EPC lingo, install the racking, install the battery, which was way more heavy than the module, and I guess that makes sense, but I didn't really realize, and mount the panels and hardware. So it just was an amazing, rewarding experience that I encourage really anyone to look into.
yeah, definitely. I feel the same way. I forgot that you were there like 3 weeks before we were. And for me, like just going to Ed Juntas, and even though I've installed solar before, just to how it made a difference in people's lives. And you mentioned about Pedro, like meeting these families. And I think in the US, we don't realize how fortunate we are to have consistent power. And it's interesting as a Commonwealth in Puerto Rico, like how much they lose power and the whole island loses power. And when we were there actually in Ed Juntas, there was one day where there was no power. and how like solar and storage are, a way of energy independence. When you talk to people about Puerto Rico about having consistent power, like they understand it. Where in the US, I think maybe obviously we have a great situation compared to other countries. And you really see that when you obviously are part of this trip. And it's interesting. You made a great point about being jaded, but then once you go there, you realize what we're doing, and you're having an impact in people's life. And it's interesting because I was like renewed after that because of everything that was going on. But then when I did that trip, I felt I just had a lot more energy and excitement about what we're doing. And the passion, still burns and burns even higher than before. So I appreciate like you sharing, Let's Share the Sun. And obviously we'll have a link to it on the podcast notes. And we're actually, the Solar Maverick podcast, we're doing a fundraiser for Let's Share the Sun on Thursday, June 5th in Jersey City, New Jersey. Actually, CleanCapital is bringing a group of the people who went on the trip because you guys are having actually an on-site that Thursday. So there are people traveling to New York. So people are going to try to make that from CleanCapital. Yeah. So I really appreciate you sharing, obviously, your experience. And then is there anything that we haven't spoke about that you would like to speak to? I mean, it's amazing, like when I think about how much we've covered in a very short period of time.
I think we really, covered it. I guess I'll just sort of end by saying like, listen, I think we all know the potential for the solar industry. Just to connect things, for a second back to where we're at with the full circle with house reconciliation, like what we're talking about here is really a real threat, right? We're talking about a possibility of dramatically increasing project costs, increasing the cost of electricity for consumers and Americans, reducing investment certainty, and really a situation that will make it harder, not easier, to build energy infrastructure in this country. So, I think that's something, if you're listening to this, you probably care about. I think like this is not the time to be on the sidelines. If you're not active with SEIA and the local trade associations, you got to get active because they are doing their hardest to defend our industry, to defend our business. But it's always going to be a more effective story if you call up and you're the one who's making the case for your business, or if your CEO is sending a letter or requesting a meeting. And so I mentioned before, like the initial starting point isn't good, but we're not at the final line yet. And so there's still opportunities along the way. SEIA recently put out sort of their own analysis of how bad this could be. We're talking about, according to them, this is going to close or cancel 287 American factories, 292,000 American jobs, erase $220 billion of local investment, eliminate 145 terawatt hours of electricity by 2030. Like those are not insignificant figures. And I think it's incumbent on those of us who are in the industry to make sure we're telling that story to our elected officials so that they stop and make sure that those bad impacts don't happen. And so I'll sort of leave it with that call of action of now is the time to get engaged. Yesterday was really the time to get engaged. We might not be able to change everything, but we can change some things.
That's a great way to end the podcast. It's interesting because we saw that with the Inflation Reduction Act, right? We didn't think there would be those substantial changes for the positive. And then in the last minute in the behind closed door meeting with Senator Schumer, and I'm totally mad.
Yeah.
So yeah, we don't know. And obviously like we should put our best foot forward. This has been an amazing interview, Scott. I really appreciate your time today. If our Mavericks want to learn more about CleanCapital or about you, what's the best way that they could do that?
So you could definitely go to CleanCapital's website, but feel free to email me or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat. Might be a little bit more busy as we're trying to defend the ITC here, but always happy to chat and meet new friends on the solar journey.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have that on the notes of the podcast as well. I appreciate everything that you do in the industry. Scott, you're a solar maverick.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's been an amazing interview. I think our Mavericks will learn a lot from it. I've learned a lot from it. And keep up the great work. I know it's extremely stressful. There's a lot going on, but one day at a time.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Benoy. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Solar Maverick Podcast. The Solar Maverick Podcast is brought to you by Reneu Energy. We're a solar development and consulting firm. If you believe that this podcast is adding value to you, please give us a 5-star review and share with those that you think could benefit from this information. Please email all questions, suggestions, and feedback to info@reneuenergy.com. That's info@reneuenergy.com. The Solar Maverick Podcast is produced by Podcast Laundry and executive produced by Benoy Thanjan and Kevin Y. Brown.